The lunatic asylum. This dreaded institution was an inescapable landmark of the last 2 centuries. Victorian asylums were packed with surprising cases, from women with postnatal depression to men with venereal disease.
To find that, syphilis, it's a scary thought.
Suffering from senile dementia. It's what I said. It's what I said.
Some of the treatments for madness could have been labelled crazy themselves. But the asylum was a serious place.
Oh, no. Oh, that's terrible. So he never went back to his family.
And ideas about inherited insanity inspired some powerful people to call for alarming measures.
Not a distant cousin of Nazi thought, is it? It's disgusting.
Now, Al Murray discovers how people who wouldn't be called mentally ill today were locked away. Sue Johnston revisits the hospital where she once worked to learn about shock treatment.
Oh my goodness, that's it, that's it. Oof.
Christopher Biggins unearths a long-buried family secret.
I feel sorry for him. Must have been horrible.
And Leslie Joseph discovers why her aunt spent a lifetime in an asylum.
Staying here for 60 years, until it was practically knocked down around her. That's a long journey.
The Victorians built Britain's asylums with high-minded ideals of helping the insane, but that optimism collapsed under the weight of numbers. And in the early 20th century, life for inmates would go from bad to worse. In 1915, one such patient was Christopher Biggins' great-grandfather, Isaac Parsons. Christopher wants to find out about Isaac's time in the Wiltshire County Asylum.
Hello.
Hello, Christopher. I'm Margaret Moles from the Archives here.
Margaret, how lovely to see you.
He's come to Wiltshire History Centre to find out more.
Now, here is my great-grandfather, Isaac Parsons, and his family, his wife and children. And I can't work out which is my grandfather, but I know that's my great-auntie Vi. She looked exactly like that right up until the time she died. I mean, it's amazing. And there he is. That's Isaac. And I know that he was put into an asylum. That's all I know.
Christopher wants to find out why Isaac was branded a lunatic at the age of 46.
We know that he was admitted in 1915.
Yes.
And this here is the medical register.
Oh, there we are. There he is. Mental disorder, recent mania?
Mania, that's right. And this is the cause.
What's that, prolonged?
Prolonged
mental stress.
Asylum doctors had many explanations for the causes of madness, but by today's standards, some of them look bizarre.
Well, alcohol, which is very interesting. Epilepsy. Eccentricity. Well, I should be there now. I mean, masturbation. What, too much of it, do you think? How fascinating they would put something like that in.
Doctors observed Isaac's behaviour.
Talks constantly, one subject of conversation running into another without intermission. Well, I understand that totally. That's a family trait.
Reported what he said.
Thinks his wife has been carrying on with other men. Oh dear, what if she had been?
Who knows?
Who knows?
And described his appearance.
Expression maniacal.
Oh dear, that doesn't sound too good, does it?
This is a photograph that was taken of Isaac when he was admitted.
Oh, my goodness. He looks ghastly there.
He looks ill.
He looks ill, and he does look like a maniac. I mean, if you take this picture of him, where he looks very much the gentleman, looking marvellous, black hair, black moustache, and there's those piercing brown eyes. They're rather frightening in a way. I mean, he looks as though he should be in an asylum.
But Christopher is shocked to discover how long Isaac was there.
Discharged or died 25th of October 1919.
Oh, my God, so he was in there a long time?
He was in there 4 years, yes.
I can't believe he was in that long. Oh, dear. I don't like that.
Lunatic patients like Isaac were not the only people in asylums. There was another category of inmates, so-called idiots and imbeciles. 100 years ago, this was a medical term for people with learning disabilities. Many were put away in specialist asylums. By 1915, a member of Al Murray's family had spent over 20 years in institutions like these. Laura Stephen was just 22 when she was sent here to the Royal Earlswood Asylum in Surrey.
So this is her admission certificate. Has been an imbecile from an early age. Imbecile. I keep saying this word and it's faintly offensive. We don't use that word anymore, so what's it probably mean?
This is somebody who we would now place within the field of having a learning disability.
Right.
Laura had been labelled an imbecile, a milder form of idiocy. She could read, write and wash and dress herself, but she didn't fit in at home. Her father was a well-known writer and intellectual, Leslie Stephen, and in his highbrow world, an imbecile daughter was potentially embarrassing.
His claim to be an intellectual would be undermined by the idea that there was weak-mindedness in his family.
Of course. Nowadays, we'd do something very different with a person like this. Very, very different.
But Laura's case notes revealed that, like her father, the doctors at Earlswood thought the asylum was the best place for her.
Much happier here than at home. Much happier here than at home. Well, they'd had enough of her at home. Usually is silly and talkative and excitable when upset, rambles on about boys.
They would be expecting her behaviour to be abnormal, so when she does behave differently, they see that as a symptom of her condition, not her unhappiness.
It's shocking.
Idiot asylums like Earlswood wanted to prepare people like Laura for the outside world by giving them education and skills. But when Laura became a troublesome patient, the asylum's response was drastic.
A modified Weir-Mitchell treatment is being tried. I've got to ask what a Weir-Mitchell treatment might be.
It's a very radical rest cure.
This rest cure was mostly used on emotionally disturbed or hysterical women. Patients were made to stay in bed for up to 2 months. To stop their muscles wasting away, they were massaged regularly, but they were also fed up on fatty foods, sometimes by force.
It's a way of controlling behaviour.
Laura's doctors took her photo while she was here.
Dear God. She looked furious. She's got the look of, get me out of this bloody place.
The Stephens were not the only privileged family putting a daughter away at Earlswood. 2 of the Queen's cousins, born with learning disabilities, spent over 40 years here. For all kinds of families, having a relative in the asylum was a shameful secret, something to be hidden, even from other family members. And this was the case for actress Leslie Joseph.
Oh, I love this one. This is my grandfather, Abraham, and he was married to my granny, who was Betsy. Oh, my lovely little Russian granny with me. And yes, I always had the impression of a very loving family, but I also had the impression that my grandfather was quite austere and a little bit frightening, maybe. And they had 11 children, so we thought. And it was only many years later that I found out there were actually 12 of them. And we had another aunt, I think she was the oldest sister, called Annie. And I can't remember who told me that she died in an asylum and had lived there for many years, since the 20s, which to me was shocking.
Leslie never met her aunt, and even within the family, Annie was not spoken of.
I don't know why she was put in the asylum. It was a taboo subject. I don't know where this edict came from that said this is not to be discussed.
Leslie's found a record of Annie's admission to Colney Hatch Asylum in 1923, which reveals Annie's behaviour in forensic detail.
On one occasion, she has broken the window in the room, and on another, she has thrown her food and her books into the fire. She threw her hat out of the car while being taken to hospital. Probably because she didn't want to go where she was going, I would have thought. I've thrown things across the room. We've all thrown things across the room. We've all fought with our parents. It doesn't sound to me like she's mad at all.
For Leslie, this document raises more questions than it answers. Could Annie have been put away for a few teenage tantrums?
If somebody exhibited behaviour that wasn't the norm, was feisty, were they put in an asylum? There's a picture of Annie here. It looks a bit like prison uniform.
But Leslie also discovers that Annie was seen by another institution first.
When and where previously treated, Bethlehem Royal Hospital. I'd like to know why she was put into Bethlehem. I think that's the beginning of the story. I don't know what I'm going to find. I don't know how I'm going to react. But I'm desperate to know the truth. There's so many questions. The biggest question is, why was one of 12 children put in an asylum?
When Annie was admitted in the early 20th century, Britain was progressing fast. But inside asylum walls, life had barely changed in decades. The system was stagnant.
Is that it there with the tower on the left?
Christopher Biggins wants to find out what it was like for his great-grandfather, Isaac Parsons, in the asylum.
This is rather lovely. Not at all what I thought. Yes, I could stay here.
He's come to the former Wiltshire County Asylum, now converted to flats, to meet historian Rodri Hayward.
Hello.
Hello.
Professor Hayward.
I'm sorry, it's only Doctor.
Very nice to see you.
Good to meet you too.
So what about this building? It's much nicer than I thought it was going to be. I was expecting some sort of horrible, dark building, but this is rather splendid.
But in Isaac's day, this beautiful exterior hid a grim reality. In the early 20th century, there were over 100,000 people locked away in asylums. Doctors were increasingly pessimistic about their patients, and a new crisis was about to push the system to breaking point.
Wow, this is very...
Christopher Biggins has just discovered his great-grandfather Isaac Parsons was admitted to the Wiltshire County Asylum in 1915, and he fears the worst.
I'm trying to be as positive as possible, but even though it's lovely outside, inside, I think that could have been things that weren't very pleasant going on.
Well, you have to realise that the moment Isaac goes in is 1915. It's in the middle of the Great War, and for many historians, the First World War is seen as the darkest point in Britain's asylum history.
Tens of thousands of traumatized soldiers return from the First World War with a new condition: shell shock. And the war also created an emergency in Britain's asylums as doctors and attendants joined up, leaving a skeleton staff in charge of massive institutions. Some asylums were requisitioned, squeezing the inmates into fewer institutions. Overcrowding and disease were rife. Isaac could not have arrived at a worse time.
And where would Isaac have been put, do you think?
From Isaac's case reports, when he first enters, he's seen as excitable, but he's not seen as dangerous. So I imagine that he would have been in one of the tranquil and convalescent wards.
Where's that?
So this will be around here.
Would he have been locked up?
Absolutely, all wards would have been locked at night.
Do you think he would have been treated well here?
When Isaac enters the asylum, it's crowded and it's difficult to offer any kind of individual treatment regime.
With no drugs other than basic sedatives, Isaac's treatment consisted of a rigid daily routine working on the asylum's farm. But it was increasingly clear that the asylum was not making people better.
That therapeutic optimism, which first inspires the design of the asylum, has all but been exhausted. This building is built for 250 inmates. By the time he arrives, there's about 800 people. And
800?
800. And the vast majority of those inmates are not being cured.
For an institution which had been built to cure, this was a catastrophic failure. Doctors were keen to shift the blame onto the patients.
This is a moment when people believe that a large part of mental illness is born through inheritance. It's actually written in the bones. And the insane begin to be seen as a race apart. They're evolutionary accidents. They're degenerates. So the function of the asylum changes. It moves from being a place where people are managed back into health to a place which simply becomes a warehouse for the insane.
It just sounds like the most horrible place in the world.
Darwin's theory of evolution meant that many people believed insanity could be inherited. They called it the hereditary taint. So when Al Murray's relative, Laura Stephen, was diagnosed with what we'd now call a learning disability, her doctors made the link to her maternal grandmother, Isabella Thackeray, who'd had a breakdown after childbirth.
Maternal grandmother, insane. Supposed cause of disease, heredity. But Laura has a learning disability. She's not a lunatic. It's just different.
It's the idea that things have a common origin, that people who have mental weakness can transmit it down the generations, and not always in the same way.
It's almost as if Isabella's history is what's condemned Laura. Maternal grandmother, insane. If they're worried about that, they're going to think there's no hope for her.
Labelled an imbecile, Laura fell into a broad category of people branded mental defectives, along with so-called idiots and the feeble-minded. Society feared that if people like Laura bred, they'd spread their mental weakness.
So there's this real fear that people who are weak-minded, which covers a whole load of conditions,
will breed and overpower us all. Is that the feeling? Oh.
The question then becomes, what should we do about it?
So that would suggest that then what you do is you confine a person so that they don't have children and they don't pass it on into the next generation. So we're heading into eugenic territory.
The eugenic movement wanted to improve Britain's racial stock through selective breeding. They believed that mental illness, criminality, drunkenness and poverty were all connected and all hereditary. So-called defectives should not be allowed to reproduce. Eugenic campaigners wanted to save the nation from this promiscuous underclass.
We are today suffering from an evil which will, if unchecked, bring ruin upon our nation. A chain is no stronger than its weakest link, and the weakest link is the mass of mentally feeble persons who live amongst us. The time has come when this special evil must be dealt with. Gosh, this is proper moral panic nonsense, isn't it? It starts off rhetorically, and then she tells you exactly who she thinks she means, and it's people who can't answer back in Laura's case. It's disgusting.
The most notorious advocates of eugenics were the Nazis, part of Hitler's plan to create a master race. But this terrifying movement was actually born here, in Britain. Inspired by Darwin's theory of natural selection, some Victorians wanted to weed out society's weakest. And by the turn of the century, eugenics had powerful supporters. In 1910, an ambitious young Home Secretary fervently argued for segregation and sterilization. His name was Winston Churchill, and in 1913 he helped the Mental Deficiency Act become law. For the next 46 years, it would be legal to detain idiots, imbeciles, and the feeble-minded against their will.
That is really frightening, and not a distant cousin of Nazi thought, is it? That if you can institutionalise people for life, if you can make that decision, then you're not that far off from sterilising them, and you're not that far off from murdering them.
Britain stopped short of sterilising so-called defectives, but in Nazi Germany, they were viciously targeted. It's estimated that the Nazis forcibly sterilised over 400,000 people by 1945, the year Laura Stephen died.
We do actually know that Laura died without ever exiting institutional care, and here we've got a copy of her death certificate.
74 years old. So from when she was 22. What a story. What a life.
In the early 20th century, being labelled an incurable lunatic could mean being consigned to a lifetime in the asylum. But one prestigious hospital had a glowing reputation for curing even difficult cases: Bethlem Royal. Now the Imperial War Museum, this famous building was originally a hospital for the mentally ill. Leslie Josephs found out that her grandfather Abraham brought her Aunt Annie here in 1922.
It turns out that this wasn't the first time that Abraham had tried to get her admitted. We found this document in the files from about 4 months before her admission.
Miss Mundy, daughter, 22 years. 22, she's a baby.
So young.
Sleepless, mute, prefers solitude, not robust, on account of waiting list of hospitals given.
So on account of the fact that Bethlehem was full at the time, she wasn't admitted.
Bethlehem was once a notorious madhouse, which gave us the name Bedlam. But by the 1920s, it provided first-class mental health care, and Abraham was desperate to get his daughter treated here.
They've given Abraham a list of other places she could be taken.
But he doesn't take them up.
No. He could have put Annie into a county asylum,
Yeah.
but he hangs on for Bethlehem. He clearly sees Bethlehem as the best place for Annie to be.
Unlike the county asylums, doctors at Bethlehem only admitted patients they thought were curable. With just 200 beds, a fifth of the size of the average county asylum, Bethlehem could give its patients more individual care. The hospital claimed a 50% recovery rate.
What Abraham is trying to do, it's rather like trying to get your child into the best school. This is somewhere where they will try very hard to cure you. This is not somewhere where you can just fester unnoticed and untreated for 10 or 20 years. It's rather strange.
It's so much better to hear
Yeah,
that
yeah.
He wanted her to come here and be looked after more than just putting her anywhere just to get away from the family.
Oh, absolutely. I think what we have here is a father who isn't trying to get rid of a troublesome daughter.
No.
I think we have a father who is genuinely trying to do the best.
Find help for her.
And he's prepared to sacrifice quite a lot of his income to do something for her.
This seems a much kinder man than I was thinking. I can't tell you how good this is to hear.
The full fees at Bethlehem would have cost Abraham a third of his entire annual salary. Luckily for the family, the hospital was a charity and chose to waive the cost of Annie's care. But after 12 months at Bethlehem, Annie was not cured. The hospital only took patients for a maximum of a year, so her father had no choice but to send her to the county asylum at Colney Hatch. Exactly the place he'd gone to such lengths to avoid.
So to have that year to hopefully be able to then go back to her family, she went to Coney Hatch and... Sorry. She never came out.
In 21st century Britain, 1 in 4 of us will experience some kind of mental health problem. We're most likely to be treated with drugs and therapy, and very few of us will go into hospital. For those who do, the average stay is just 70 days. 100 years ago, things were very different. Nearly a fifth of asylum patients stayed for more than 10 years.
He's put into the asylum and he looks like that, which I think is quite frightening. The change in him.
Christopher Biggins has found out that his great-grandfather Isaac Parsons was admitted to the Wiltshire Asylum aged 46 and was there for 4 years.
As a matter of interest, I don't know when Isaac died. Do we know when Isaac died?
Isaac dies in the asylum in October 1919.
No!
Yes.
Are you serious?
Yes, and...
He died in this asylum?
Yes, he never comes home.
Oh, no! Oh, that's terrible. So he never went back to his family?
I'm afraid not, no.
Oh, my God, I'm quite shocked. He died in a lunatic asylum.
I'm really sorry, Christopher.
Horrified by this discovery, Christopher wants to know how Isaac's life ended.
This is the final page of Isaac's casebook.
On the 21st of July, he is very noisy, destructive and abusive. Has to be confined to the side room. What is a side room?
It's what we would refer to as something like a padded cell.
A padded cell?
As infamous as the asylums themselves, the padded cell was used when patients were especially disturbed.
On the 27th of August, destructive, noisy and dirty. The 20th of October, growing rapidly weaker. On the 25th of October 19, he passed away. Cause of death: general paralysis of the insane. It's terrible. I feel sorry for him. Must have been horrible. can't believe it. As such a young man, leaving a young family. Horrible. No wonder it was never mentioned.
The horror is only deepened by the fact that this fate is shared by so many in the asylum. You know, for the vast majority, unless you get better in the first couple of years, it was a one-way ticket.
Isaac died of general paralysis of the insane, known as GPI, the final fatal stage of syphilis. Around a third of long-stay male patients were suffering from this disease.
It's the final stages of syphilitic infection, which is causing like massive neurological damage.
Syphilis?
It is syphilis, I'm afraid.
So it was a sexually transmitted disease?
Outside the asylum walls, syphilis was rife, particularly amongst military men. In his youth, Isaac served with the British Army in India, and, like many squaddies at the time, contracted VD. But a death from syphilis still carried a stigma.
It says a lot, you know. Auntie Vi, who I was closest to, I mean, she must have been a teenager when this was happening, and so she wouldn't want to admit to this. I mean, she was a very snobby, straight-laced woman that I knew. So she would never have ever admitted that her father, A, was in an asylum, and B, passed away with general paralysis of the insane.
And I don't think any judgment hangs over Isaac.
No. No. Did then.
Tragically for Isaac, he died at the dawn of a new era of treatment which might have saved his life. Doctors had just discovered that inducing malaria in GPI patients could help cure them. Frustrated by decades of stagnation, from the 1920s onwards, doctors began experimenting with controversial new treatments for mental illness. They shocked patients with electricity and used insulin to induce a coma. The most extreme was lobotomy, a surgical procedure which severed connections in the brain. And in the 1950s, new antipsychotic drugs were developed, which would change the asylum forever. Actress Sue Johnston saw this transformation firsthand when she took a summer job in an asylum in 1967.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, that's it. That's it. But I recognise the front.
She hasn't been back for nearly 50 years.
Oof.
Sue was a young drama student when she worked in this hospital outside Lincoln. Like many old asylums, it's being turned into flats.
It's vast. I just cannot remember it being this huge. It just takes your breath away. You think of the numbers that must have been in here. Well, what, thousands. That's how I would have pictured it, you know, the tower above it. I remember looking out, I mean, possibly from that bay window over there, and you couldn't see anything for miles. Just farmland, gardens, cricket pitches, I mean, it was just a whole world. And that was me in the 60s, Mrs. Buffon. I turned up on the first day, and I was the lowest of the low on the ward orderly. Had no training, had never been on in a hospital in my life.
On the ward, Sue saw the new treatments in action. Antipsychotics were the first effective drug treatments ever invented, but early versions came with terrible side effects.
An awful lot of them were zombified and just taken from the beds. You got them dressed in the morning and you plopped them in the chair and you gave them their drugs, and then that was it till you brought them over, sat them for their lunch. They'd been shuttered down in a way. They were so vulnerable. That's what makes your heart go out to them. I've never forgotten them. It made a huge impression on me.
Sue's hospital also used ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. Invented in the 1930s to treat schizophrenia, by the 60s it was used on a wide range of conditions. Part of Sue's job was taking patients down for their treatment.
This was a real eye-opener for me because I'd heard of shock treatment and people biting on bits of wood while electric contraptions were stuck to their head. So that was in my mind when I took these women down. I used to try and make them laugh. I think that was my way of getting their minds off it and sort of do outrageous things with them in their wheelchairs. So going to the treatment room was better than coming back. When they came back, they'd gone. Quite shocking to see somebody wiped of personality, dead eyes. It became a part of the job that I hated. I'd really like to know what it is, what it does, what they achieve with it.
By the 1960s, it seemed asylums caused just as many problems as they claimed to solve. And one of the biggest was institutionalization. Even if they could be cured, many patients were so used to asylum life that they couldn't cope outside. It was a catch-22. Leslie Joseph's aunt, Annie Mundy, was part of the last generation that would spend a lifetime in an asylum. But Leslie wants to solve the mystery of why she was admitted in the first place. She's hoping that the archives of Bethlehem Royal, the first hospital to treat Annie, will answer her questions.
The only bit of the jigsaw so far that is missing, and to me it's probably the most important one, is why she was admitted.
Well, this is the casebook of 1922, and Annie's records will be in here. Here she is.
Oh, so Annie Mundy. No amount of persuasion will induce her to reply to any questions. At times she is catatonic. She's very difficult with her food. Had to be tube-fed. She was tube-fed. That seems very aggressive treatment.
It is a dramatic intervention, there's no doubt about it.
Can I go on?
Yes, please do.
She sits with her fingers over her ears and suffers from auditory hallucinations. 2 months further on, patient laughs and talks to herself. And then the year on, patient was today discharged by the committee, not improved.
After Annie was discharged, her doctor wrote to her father Abraham with his diagnosis, the answer Leslie's been searching for.
You see, I've been fine up to now. From the day of her admission, one has been reluctant to diagnose her case as one of dementia praecox, which is unfortunately considered a somewhat intractable disease. I am sorry to say I have come to the conclusion that she is suffering from this condition which causes the prognosis to be unfavourable. So there we are. So dementia praecox is what?
We're talking about schizophrenia.
Right.
They didn't have the term schizophrenia then.
No.
At the time, there were no effective drugs for schizophrenia. Doctors had only basic sedatives to treat Annie.
Not easy to know that she was schizophrenic.
But Colin has something else to show Leslie, a letter written by her grandfather to Annie's doctors.
Oh, my goodness. Oh. Dear sir, I saw it right along that whilst physically she has immensely improved under the care of your hospital, her mental condition, however, remained the same. I am nevertheless quite conscious of the fact that all the members of your excellent staff tried their very best for my child. Yours faithfully, Abraham Mundy. The letter says everything in a way that I needed to know about her and her condition. And the care and love in it, to me, is incredibly important. You have to keep this, don't you? This letter.
Yes, we can't take that out.
Have that letter,
I'm afraid you can't have this piece of paper.
I've still got the chair he used to sit in, and he probably would have sat on that chair at his desk to write this letter about Annie, his eldest daughter, that he obviously tried so desperately to help and couldn't. And this actually puts a lot of things to rest in my mind.
The swinging 60s turned Britain upside down. And just as society was changing, so too were the asylums. Wards were unlocked and patients given new freedoms. Since the Victorian era, we'd shut the mentally ill away, but now we wanted to help them back into the community. But asylums were still using controversial treatments. Many have now been abandoned, but one that stood the test of time is ECT. Having taken many patients to the door of the ECT suite in the 60s, Sue Johnston now wants to know what actually happened inside.
So this is the ECT suite in here.
The ECT machine delivers an electric current via two paddles.
They'll be put either side of the patient's head, or sometimes both onto one side of the head. And that's just for a few seconds, and what the electric current does is set off a seizure in the person's brain.
Like a fit?
Yes, it's exactly the same as a fit.
Before ECT is administered, patients are given an anaesthetic and a muscle relaxant.
Why would they have to have a muscle relaxant?
Well, the point of the muscle relaxant is that then when the patient has the seizure, they don't have any problems from their muscles clenching excessively.
ECT does provoke an emotional response, doesn't it? And why is that?
Because in the early days, it was given to patients without an anaesthetic and without a muscle relaxant.
So it would have been quite frightening.
I should think it was absolutely terrifying. And although that stopped being the way ECT was given by the early 1950s, the myth sort of perpetuated.
Yes, that's exactly me. That's exactly what my opinion was.
But yes, when you say I'm going to put electricity across someone's brain, I mean, you can understand why it has such a mixed or misunderstood press. It is a bizarre thing to do.
It might be a silly question, but what exactly does it do?
Well, it's not at all a silly question. So, 75 years after it started, I think it's fair to say nobody knows why it works.
Oh.
It does so many things to the brain that the problem is nobody quite knows which of those changes is really the important one.
In the 1960s, over 50,000 patients a year were given ECT for a range of conditions, including schizophrenia and postnatal depression. Today, it's a targeted treatment for severe depression.
So on that then, if one of your children had severe depression, would you find it acceptable for him to have ECT?
I wouldn't want to make the judgment myself, but if my colleague's judgment was that ECT was the right treatment for them, I would definitely
You definitely
would. I would, yes.
Well, that's a really... you couldn't ask for better than that, could you really?
The tide was turning against the asylums. They were out of date, discredited, and expensive to run. New drug treatments which made it possible for patients to live in the community were the nail in the coffin. In the 1980s, asylums started closing down. Leslie Joseph wants to find out about the asylum where her Aunt Annie lived for most of her life. Built as Colney Hatch. When it closed, it was called Friern Hospital, and today it's luxury flats.
When Friern Hospital was built, it was the biggest lunatic asylum in Europe.
This is a film made here in Friern Barnet Hospital in 1985.
Some of the corridors are a third of a mile long.
Gosh, it's absolutely vast.
Some patients don't get better. This is their permanent home.
My aunt, when she came, I think was 23, with a diagnosis of what we would now call schizophrenia. So what would the long-term prognosis have been?
I'm afraid that your aunt was very, very ill. I've had a chance to look at your aunt's notes, and even if she were to come today, I would feel, sadly, and there's no way around this, I would see her as somebody who's going to have a tougher time than most patients. Sorry about that. But
no,
it's
difficult.
The aim would have been to try and calm her down. She would have been looked after by staff who were neither surprised nor fazed by the severity of her illness.
In 1983, Friern Hospital was marked for closure. Annie's home of 60 years was shutting down around her.
This wing of the hospital is being knocked down because the wards are no longer needed. The remaining patients will be restored to the community.
At its peak, Friern was home to nearly 3,000 patients, and it took 10 years to move everybody out. Annie had first been admitted here in the 1920s when she was a 23-year-old clerk, but she never returned to the outside world. She died here in 1985.
I don't know if you've seen this, but this is your aunt's death certificate. One thing that I found touching is it gives her profession as shorthand typist.
Shorthand typist retired?
Retired, yeah. People a little bit frozen in time. We all remember what we did in life, even when they've been in hospital for decades. And patients always tell me what they did, even if it was 20 years ago. And she died a still and calm death.
Could she have been happy?
Certainly possibilities that she might have been happy. I can't speak with certainty, but she may have had good phases that we don't know about.
Yeah.
I would imagine she would, frankly. In
I
60
like to think
years.
she
Yeah,
would.
Yeah.
Yeah. Staying here for 60 years, until it was practically knocked down around her. That's a long journey. I got to feel maybe I do know her a little better. I will take away an acknowledgement to Annie that I have helped to tell her story, which I couldn't do while she was alive, but with all the respect and dignity that I can now that she has died.
Few mourned the asylum's passing when they closed. But in the 21st century, we're still debating how best to care for the mentally ill. Nevertheless, these monumental institutions still cast a shadow over countless families whose lives were shaped by their secrets from the asylum.
John Sim is a cop on the run in the police chase like no other. Prey is just about to start over on ITV Encore. They're Sweet 16 and planning for what they think is the biggest night of their lives. We follow their story in Prom Crazy Frocks and Ferraris tomorrow night at 9. On the way next tonight, though, it's the news at 10.